The search parties had given up after the third week. The forest had swallowed Thomas Blackwood whole, leaving nothing behind but a worn hunting jacket caught on a branch near Widow's Creek. That's what they told Catherine when she demanded they keep looking, that nature takes what it wants and sometimes there's nothing left to find. But Catherine knew better. A wife always knows. The jacket was placed there deliberately, like a false clue in a twisted game. By the time the Sheriff's Department officially declared Thomas Blackwood dead in 1977, his children, Emma, just 12, and Daniel, barely 9, had already grown accustomed to the hollow silence where their father's booming laughter used to be. Catherine would stare out the kitchen window toward the woods for hours, a coffee cup growing cold between her hands. "Your father is coming back," she'd whisper to them, even as the light in her eyes dimmed with each passing season. "He would never leave us willingly." But Thomas Blackwood never returned to the small house at the edge of Pinewood Valley, and eventually they stopped waiting. It was late December 1976 when Thomas vanished. The morning had begun like any other winter Saturday. Thomas kissed Catherine goodbye, tousled Daniel's hair, and promised to bring back a turkey for Christmas dinner. Emma remembered how he'd winked at her when he said he might let her try shooting his new rifle if she finished her math homework. He'd packed his lunch, 2 ham sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of black coffee, and headed toward Mason's Ridge, his favorite hunting spot since boyhood. By nightfall, when the first snowflakes began to fall and Thomas hadn't returned, Catherine had felt the first tremors of panic. By midnight, half the town was combing the woods with flashlights and dogs, calling his name into the darkness. They found his truck parked at the trailhead, rifle missing, but backpack still inside. The search continued for 23 days through bitter cold and blinding snow before they found that jacket, blood-stained and torn, hanging from a branch like a grim flag of surrender. The official report concluded that Thomas Blackwood, 45, had likely been attacked by a bear or mountain lion, dragged deep into the wilderness where his remains would never be recovered. A tragic accident, they said. A terrible loss for the community. But there were rumors, whispers that followed Emma and Daniel through school hallways, conversations that stopped when they entered the general store. Some said Thomas had gambling debts he couldn't pay. Others claimed he'd been having an affair with the young waitress at the diner, who mysteriously quit the same week he disappeared. The cruelest rumors suggested he'd simply grown tired of family life and walked away, leaving his responsibilities behind like that abandoned jacket in the woods. Emma refused to believe any of it. Her father had taught her to look for tracks in the snow, to read the signs nature leaves behind, and something about his disappearance left no tracks at all. It was too clean, too complete, as if someone had carefully erased every trace of Thomas Blackwood from the face of the earth. The years passed slowly in Pinewood Valley. Catherine never remarried, though Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church came calling with casseroles and kind words for nearly a decade. She kept Thomas's clothes hanging in the closet, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his favorite armchair angled toward the window where he used to watch for deer at dawn. It was as if she had turned their home into a museum of absence, preserving the negative space where Thomas should have been. Emma left for college at 18, desperate to escape the pitying glances and the constant reminder of what she'd lost. Daniel stayed longer, dropping out of high school to work at the lumber mill, trying to fill his father's shoes and support his mother. But by 21, even he had to leave, the weight of his father's disappearance too heavy to carry in a town where everyone remembered. Catherine remained alone in the house, waiting for a return that would never come. Emma became a biologist, studying the migratory patterns of birds, creatures that leave but always find their way back home. Daniel joined the military, perhaps seeking the structure and discipline his father had once provided. They would visit Catherine on holidays, watching her grow older and more fragile, her hope never quite extinguished despite the decades that passed. They never spoke about the possibility that their father had chosen to leave them. It was easier to believe he'd been taken than to accept he might have walked away. And so the story remained frozen in time. Thomas Blackwood, devoted husband and father, tragically lost to the wilderness on a cold December day in 1976. A story they told themselves so often it calcified into truth. Until July 16, 2016, exactly 40 years and 7 months after Thomas disappeared. Emma was 52 now, divorced, with grown children of her own. Her daughter Rachel, a digital marketing specialist, had convinced her to join Facebook to see the grandkids' pictures. Emma rarely used it, finding the platform confusing and overly personal. But that summer evening, as she scrolled through her feed, a friend's suggestion appeared that made her coffee mug slip from her fingers and shatter against the floor. Thomas Blackwood, the profile read. The profile picture showed an elderly man with a white beard, standing on a fishing boat squinting into the sun. A man whose eyes, those distinctive hazel eyes with flecks of gold, she would recognize anywhere. Her father's eyes. Emma's hands trembled so violently, she could barely tap the profile to open it. What she found there would unravel 40 years of grief, questions, and carefully constructed family mythology. The profile had been created just 3 months earlier. There weren't many posts, a few fishing photos, some shared news articles about climate change, a birthday celebration at what looked like a small beachside restaurant. The location was listed as Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And there, in a photo album titled Mi Familia, was a picture that stopped Emma's heart. Her father, looking 20 years younger than he should, standing with his arm around a Mexican woman, perhaps 15 years his junior. Beside them were 3 adults who shared their features, 2 men and a woman who appeared to be in their 30s. The caption, written in Spanish, translated roughly to "Celebrating 35 years with my beautiful Teresa and our children." 35 years. Emma did the math with numb detachment. 1981, 5 years after Thomas Blackwood had supposedly died in the snowy woods of Pinewood Valley. 5 years after Catherine had begun her lifelong vigil at the window. 5 years after Emma and Daniel had become those poor Blackwood children. Her father hadn't died. He had escaped, reinvented himself, started a new family while his first one shattered under the weight of his absence. The room seemed to tilt around Emma as decades of certainty crumbled. She called Daniel immediately, her voice barely audible through the shock. "It's Dad," was all she could say. "He's alive in Mexico, and Daniel, he has another family." The revelation struck Daniel like physical blow. The brother who had once idolized their father, who had tried to become the man of the house at just 9 years old, who had joined the military partly to make his father proud wherever he was, perhaps in heaven, perhaps watching from beyond, now had to face the betrayal of knowing Thomas had been alive all along. Daniel had spent 4 tours of duty in combat zones, had faced enemy fire, and seen friends die, but nothing had prepared him for this particular wound. His father, the mythic figure whose absence had shaped his entire life, had chosen to leave them, had chosen another family, had chosen a different life while they mourned him. It was almost unbearable, but the cruelest part was yet to come. Catherine, now 84, and living in an assisted living facility after a stroke had left her partially paralyzed, still spoke of Thomas with unwavering devotion. "Your father would be so proud of you both," she would say whenever Emma and Daniel visited together. "He loved us so much." What would this knowledge do to her? Could they tell her that the man she had defended against town gossip, the man whose memory she had protected fiercely for 40 years, had betrayed her in the most fundamental way? Emma and Daniel faced an impossible decision, whether to preserve their mother's lifelong faith in her husband or to confront the truth that would destroy her. They agreed to investigate further before making any decisions. Emma, with Rachel's help, began carefully exploring Thomas's Facebook profile without sending a friend request. They discovered he now went by Tom Black, a simple anglicization that had kept him hidden all these years. His profile showed a comfortable life, fishing trips with his Mexican sons, birthday celebrations with what appeared to be grandchildren, retirement parties with friends who knew nothing of his previous life. In one photo, he wore a t-shirt from a fishing charter business called Black's Charters in Puerto Vallarta. A quick Google search confirmed the business existed, founded in 1982 by an American expatriate named Tom Black. The timing aligned perfectly with Thomas's disappearance. He had established himself in Mexico within 6 years of vanishing from Pinewood Valley. But how had he done it? How had he staged his own death so convincingly that even search and rescue experts believed he had been killed? And why? The Thomas Blackwood that Emma and Daniel remembered had been loving, attentive, seemingly content with his life. What could have driven him to such an extreme decision? Emma's daughter Rachel, who had initially been stunned into silence by the discovery, finally found her voice. "You have to confront him," she said. "After what he did to Grandma, to both of you, you deserve answers." Daniel's response was harsher. "Confront him? I want to destroy him, everything he built on our suffering. He left us, Emma. He left us and never looked back. But Emma, always the more analytical of the siblings, counseled caution. We need to understand what happened first. We need the full story before we do anything. And so, with Rachel's technical assistance, Emma crafted a message to Thomas Blackwood, or Tom Black, as he now called himself. She chose her words carefully, neither accusatory nor emotional. My name is Emma Blackwood. I believe you are my father. I would appreciate an opportunity to speak with you. She attached a recent photo of herself, Catherine, and Daniel at Catherine's 80th birthday celebration, a quiet but unmistakable reminder of the family he had abandoned. 3 days passed with no response. Emma checked her messages obsessively, vacillating between hope for answers and fear of rejection. Daniel called twice daily for updates, his anger growing with each passing day. On the 4th morning, Emma's notification sound chimed just as she was pouring her coffee. The message was brief, almost clinical. I think you have mistaken me for someone else. I'm sorry for your loss, but I am not the man you're looking for. A denial. So predictable it was almost laughable. Emma stared at the message, noticing the perfect English, the careful phrasing. This was not the confused response of someone wrongly identified. This was the calculated deflection of a man who had spent 40 years hiding from his past. Emma forwarded the message to Daniel, who called her immediately, rage evident in his voice. He's lying. He's still lying after all this time. Emma agreed. But something in her scientist's mind clicked into place. Daniel, she said slowly, how did he disappear so completely? How did he get to Mexico, establish a new identity, start a business? This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. And that means someone helped him. Daniel finished the thought. Someone knew he wasn't dead. The realization opened new avenues of investigation. Who in Pinewood Valley might have assisted Thomas in his elaborate disappearance? Who might have known the truth all these years? They compiled a list of Thomas's closest friends, most now dead or suffering from dementia, and business associates from the lumber mill where he'd worked as a foreman. One name kept surfacing, Robert Bobby Winters, Thomas's childhood friend and hunting buddy. The same Bobby Winters who had organized the search parties when Thomas vanished. The same Bobby Winters who had found Thomas's jacket by Widow's Creek. The same Bobby Winters who had later sold his hardware store and moved to Arizona around 1980, just a few years after Thomas disappeared. Daniel, who had remained in occasional contact with Bobby's son, Jason, made a call. Jason, it's Daniel Blackwood. I need your father's contact information. It's important. Family business. Jason hesitated noticeably. My dad passed last year, Daniel. I'm sorry. Lung cancer. Another dead end. But Daniel pressed on. Jason, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Did your father ever say anything about my dad? Anything unusual? The long silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Finally, Jason sighed. Daniel, I promised my father I'd never speak about this. It was his dying request. Your father knew something about my dad's disappearance, didn't he? Daniel's voice was tight, controlled. Daniel, I can't. My father is alive, Jason. Living in Mexico. We found him on Facebook. The shocked gasp was audible. After a moment, Jason spoke in a hushed tone. Jesus Christ, he actually did it. He really did it. Did what, Jason? What did your father know? Not over the phone, Jason said. I'll email you some things. My father kept records. I found them after he died. I never knew what to do with them. The email arrived that evening. Scans of handwritten letters, postmarked from Mexico to Bobby Winters' Arizona address, spanning from 1978 to 1992. They were signed simply T, but the handwriting was unmistakably Thomas Blackwood's. The earliest letter, dated March 1978, confirmed their worst suspicions. Bobby, I'm settled now. The money you sent helped more than you know. I've found work on fishing boats. Turns out rich tourists will pay good money to have an American guide who speaks decent Spanish. No one asks questions here. No one cares about my past. I dream about the kids sometimes, and see too. I tell myself they're better off without me, that the insurance money will give them opportunities I never could. I know what the town thinks of me now. Coward, deserter, maybe worse. Let them think it. It's better than the truth. I'll send a new address when I'm more permanent. Burn this letter. T, insurance money. The words jumped off the page. After Thomas had been declared dead, Catherine had indeed received a life insurance payout, $50,000, a significant sum in 1977. She had used it to pay off their mortgage and set aside college funds for Emma and Daniel. Money Thomas had apparently planned for them to receive, as if it could compensate for his absence. The later letters chronicled Thomas's new life. Meeting Teresa in 1979, the birth of their first child in 1981, the founding of his charter business in 1982. He mentioned Emma and Daniel occasionally, asking if Bobby had news of them, but never expressing any desire to return or reveal himself. The final letter from 1992 indicated a cooling of even this tenuous connection. Bobby, I think it's best we end our correspondence. My life is here now, completely. Teresa knows nothing of my past, nor do my children. It would destroy everything I've built. I appreciate your friendship and your help all those years ago, but some doors are better left closed forever. Take care of yourself. T. Emma and Daniel read the letters together over video chat, their faces growing more pained with each revelation. The Thomas Blackwood described in these letters bore little resemblance to the father they remembered. This was a calculating, selfish man who had orchestrated his own disappearance, who had involved his friend in an elaborate fraud, who had built a new life on the foundation of their suffering. But why? Emma kept asking. What was the truth he mentioned that was worse than being thought a deserter? What could possibly justify this? Daniel's military training had taught him to look for motives, to understand the enemy. Something was threatening him, or us. Something bad enough that disappearing seemed like the only option. They began researching Thomas's life in the months before his disappearance. Emma flew to Pinewood Valley to access old newspaper archives not available online. The town had shrunk over the decades. The lumber mill closed. Many businesses boarded up as young people left for better opportunities, but the local historical society maintained meticulous records, including back issues of the Pinewood Gazette. Emma spent days poring over newspapers from 1976, looking for anything that might explain her father's drastic actions. Nothing seemed unusual. Lumber mill production was down. There was debate about a new highway bypass, the usual small-town politics and social events. Thomas Blackwood was mentioned occasionally as the mill foreman, once in relation to contract negotiations with the owners. Nothing that suggested crisis or danger. On her third day of research, Emma decided to look further back, extending her search to 1975. And there, in a small article dated August 17, 1975, she found something curious. Local mill foreman testifies in grand jury investigation. The article was brief, noting only that Thomas Blackwood had provided testimony in a sealed grand jury proceeding in the state capital related to business practices in the lumber industry. No details were given about the nature of his testimony or the outcome of the investigation. Emma took this information to Harriet Chen, the town librarian who had known the Blackwood family since Emma was a child. Harriet's eyes widened at the mention of the grand jury. "Oh, that was quite the scandal, though much of it was kept quiet," Harriet said, lowering her voice though no one else was in the library. "Your father was a whistleblower. The mill owners were involved with organized crime figures from Chicago, money laundering, I believe, and perhaps illegal logging on protected federal land. Your father discovered discrepancies in the books and reported them to authorities." "But what happened with the case?" Emma asked. Harriet frowned. "That's the strange part. The investigation suddenly closed about 3 months before your father disappeared. No indictments, no public statements. It simply went away." Emma felt a chill run through her. "Are you saying my father was in danger because of his testimony?" "I can't say for certain," Harriet replied carefully. "But there were rumors that the mill owners had connections to very dangerous people, and around that time your father seemed different, anxious, always looking over his shoulder. This new information cast Thomas's disappearance in an entirely different light. Not the act of a selfish man abandoning his family, but potentially a desperate measure to protect them." Emma called Daniel immediately to share what she'd learned. "It makes a twisted kind of sense," Daniel admitted. "If Dad testified against people with mob connections, and then the case mysteriously went away, they might have threatened him," Emma finished, "or threatened us." "And Dad's solution was to fake his death and disappear," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "To remove the target from our backs by removing himself." The theory required verification. Emma reached out to former mill workers still living in the area, Most were reluctant to speak about those days, changing the subject or claiming poor memory. But Martin Delgado, who had worked directly under Thomas as assistant foreman, finally confirmed their suspicions after Emma pressed him. "Your dad was a good man, Emma." "An honest man," Martin said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he sipped his coffee. "When he found out what the Keller brothers were doing with the mill, letting those Chicago guys use our lumber shipments to move cash, cutting trees in the national forest, he couldn't look the other way. He went to the FBI. And then the case was dropped," Emma prompted. Martin nodded grimly. "Someone got to someone. That's all I know. But 2 weeks before your dad disappeared, I saw him arguing with a man I didn't recognize in the mill parking lot. A city type, expensive suit. Your dad came back white as a ghost. He told me, 'Martin, if anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident.' I should have said something after he disappeared, but I was scared. I had my own family to think about." Emma absorbed this information with growing horror. "You think they threatened to kill him?" "Worse," Martin said quietly. "I think they threatened all of you. Your mum, you kids, and your dad made a choice." The pieces were falling into place. Thomas had discovered illegal activity, reported it, and then found himself and his family threatened when the case mysteriously collapsed. His disappearance hadn't been an abandonment, but a desperate attempt at protection. By removing himself and making it appear he died in an accident, he'd removed the threat to his family. The mob had no reason to target Catherine and the children if Thomas was already dead. Emma shared everything with Daniel, who received the information with conflicted emotions. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then Dad didn't abandon us. He sacrificed himself for us. But he started a new family," Emma countered. "He built a whole new life in Mexico while Mum waited for him for 40 years. Maybe he thought he could never come back," Daniel suggested. "Maybe he thought it was still too dangerous. And then years passed and he had a new family, and coming back would mean destroying everything for everyone." They debated for hours, trying to reconcile the father they remembered with both the man who had left them and the man who might have been trying to protect them. The letters to Bobby Winters suggested both versions could be true. A man who cared enough to ensure his family received his life insurance, but who also built a new life without looking back. One question remained unanswered. Was it still dangerous? Had Thomas stayed away all these years because he believed the threat remained? Emma and Daniel needed to know before they decided whether to confront him directly. Daniel's military connections provided a possible avenue for answers. Through a former colleague now working in federal law enforcement, he made inquiries about the closed grand jury investigation from 1975. What he learned was illuminating. The case had indeed involved money laundering through the Pinewood Valley lumber mill by associates of the Chicago outfit. The investigation had been shut down after key witnesses recanted or disappeared. The FBI file noted that threats had likely been made against cooperating witnesses, including Thomas Blackwood. However, the agents responsible for the case had believed Thomas was genuinely dead after his disappearance, with one agent noting, "Blackwood's death likely not connected to the investigation. Tragic timing and wilderness accident." Most importantly, Daniel's contact confirmed that the organization involved had been dismantled in the early 1990s during a major RICO case. The Keller brothers, who had owned the mill, had both died in the early 2000s. Whatever threat had existed in 1976 was long gone. "He could have come back," Daniel said when he called Emma with this information. "By the 90s at least he could have contacted us, told us he was alive. But he didn't," Emma said quietly, "because by then he had his new family. Coming back would have meant leaving them." The revelation left them at a crossroads. Their father had initially disappeared to protect them, an act of sacrifice rather than abandonment, but his choice to remain hidden long after the danger had passed, to start a new family without ever reaching out to his first one, was still a profound betrayal. How could they reconcile these contradictory truths? And what about their mother? Catherine Blackwood had spent her life faithful to the memory of a man who had built another life without her. She had defended him against rumors, had waited for a return that would never come, had preserved his memory for their children. Now at 84 and in fragile health, should she learn that her lifelong devotion had been to a man who had chosen to leave her behind? Emma and Daniel grappled with this question for weeks, their anger at their father tempered by the understanding that his initial disappearance had been an act of protection. Finally, they decided that Catherine deserved to know the truth, but not the whole truth. They would tell her that Thomas had been forced to disappear because of his testimony, that he had gone into something like a witness protection program to keep them safe. They would omit the second family, the new identity he had chosen for himself, the decades he had spent building a life without them, even after the danger had passed. It was a merciful half-truth that would allow Catherine to maintain her belief in Thomas's love while explaining his absence. Before approaching their mother, however, they decided to confront their father one last time. Emma crafted a new message to the Facebook account, Thomas Blackwood, or Tom Black. We know everything. We know about the grand jury testimony against the Keller brothers and their Chicago connections. We know about the threats that forced you to disappear. We know about your correspondence with Bobby Winters. We understand why you left in 1976, but the danger has been gone for decades. You could have come back to us. You could have told us you were alive. We are not contacting you to disrupt your current life or to expose you to your new family. We only want to know, why did you never come back, even when it was safe? Your children deserve that answer. Emma and Daniel. This time the response came within hours. A private phone number with the message, "Call me, please." Emma and Daniel decided to make the call together on speakerphone. When the line connected, there was a long silence before a voice spoke. Older, with a slight accent after decades in Mexico, but unmistakably their father's voice. "Emma? Daniel?" The voice cracked with emotion. "Is it really you?" Daniel couldn't speak, overcome by hearing his father's voice for the first time in 40 years. Emma managed to respond, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Yes, it's us. We found you, despite everything you did to disappear." Another long pause. "I never thought I'd hear your voices again," Thomas said finally. "I don't know what to say." "The truth would be a good start." Daniel found his voice, hard and cold. "We know why you left in 1976. What we don't know is why you never came back." Thomas's sigh carried 4 decades of regret. "I thought about coming back every day for the first few years. I made Bobby promise to watch over you, to let me know if you were safe. When the mill closed in 82, I thought maybe the danger had passed. I even came back to Pinewood Valley once in 83. I watched the house from a distance. I saw Catherine in the garden. I saw you, Daniel, working on that old Chevy in the driveway. You looked happy. Your lives had moved on. So you decided to let us keep thinking you were dead?" Emma's voice shook with anger. "Do you have any idea what your death did to us, to Mom?" "I had already been gone for nearly 7 years by then," Thomas said quietly. I had met someone in Mexico. We had a child on the way. Coming back would have meant destroying 2 families instead of 1. I told myself you were better off with the father you remembered than with the truth." "That wasn't your decision to make," Daniel said bitterly. "That was our loss to process, our grief to bear. You took that choice away from us." "You're right," Thomas admitted. "I made choices for all of us, and maybe they were the wrong choices. I was trying to protect you at first, and then I was protecting myself, my new life, my new family. It was easier to stay dead than to face what I'd done." "Does your Mexican family know about us?" Emma asked. "No," Thomas said after a pause. "Teresa knows I was married before, that I left a difficult situation in the States. She doesn't know the details. My children there, they know nothing. The irony was painful. 2 families, neither with the complete truth, both living with the ghost of who Thomas Blackwood really was." "Mom never stopped waiting for you," Emma said, wanting him to feel the weight of Catherine's decades of faithfulness. "She never remarried. She kept your clothes in the closet. She defended you against every rumor in town." Thomas's breathing became ragged, as if he was fighting tears. "Catherine was the best person I ever knew. She deserved better than what happened. Better than me." "Yes, she did," Daniel agreed coldly. Is she still alive?" Thomas asked hesitantly. Emma and Daniel exchanged a look over the phone. This was the crux of everything. Their mother, still alive, still believing in the myth of Thomas Blackwood, devoted husband, taken too soon. "She's 84, Emma said. "She had a stroke 2 years ago. She's in assisted living now." "Oh, Catherine," Thomas whispered, and they could hear genuine grief in his voice. "I never stopped loving her, you know, even after everything." "That's not love," Daniel snapped. "Love doesn't do what you did." "You're right," Thomas conceded. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it." "What do you want from us?" Emma asked. "Why agree to this call at all?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to hear your voices once more before I die. I'm not well. Cancer. The doctors give me less than a year. The news should have affected them more, Emma thought. But how do you mourn a father you've already grieved decades ago? A father who chose to remain dead to you? We're going to tell Mom a version of the truth, Daniel said. That you had to disappear because of the testimony to keep us safe. She deserves to die knowing she was right about you, that you didn't just abandon us. But we won't tell her about your other family. That would break her heart all over again. Thank you, Thomas whispered. She deserves peace. We're not doing it for you, Emma clarified. We're doing it for her. I understand, Thomas said. Would you tell her I loved her every day, that I never stopped loving her? Emma and Daniel didn't respond to this request. After a long silence, Emma asked the question that had been burning inside her for weeks. Were you ever going to tell your Mexican family the truth? About us, about who you really are? Thomas's response was heavy with resignation. I wrote letters to each of my children there, to be opened after my death. They explain everything, who I was, why I disappeared, about you, my first family. They'll probably hate me for it, just as you have every right to. So you're a coward to the end, Daniel said bitterly, waiting until you're dead to face the consequences. Yes, Thomas agreed simply. I suppose I am. The conversation continued for another hour, Thomas answering their questions about his disappearance, about Bobby Winters' role in helping him establish a new identity, about his life in Mexico. He asked about their lives too. Emma's work as a biologist, Daniel's military service, their own children. It was surreal, this catching up of 4 decades in a single phone call, with none of the warmth or connection that should exist between a father and his children. Just information exchanged across an unbridgeable gulf of time and betrayal. When they finally ended the call, Emma and Daniel sat in silence for a long time, trying to process everything they had learned. Their father had left to protect them, an act of love, but had stayed away out of cowardice and self-preservation. He had built a second life while they grew up fatherless. He had chosen comfort over honesty, again and again. And now, facing death, he was finally confronting the consequences of those choices. 2 weeks later, Emma and Daniel sat beside Catherine's bed in the assisted living facility. They had rehearsed what they would say, how much truth to share, how to frame Thomas's disappearance as an act of protection rather than abandonment. Catherine listened with surprising calmness as they explained about the grand jury testimony, the threats from organized crime, Thomas's desperate choice to fake his death to keep them safe. When they finished, Catherine smiled sadly and took their hands in her frail ones. I always knew he didn't leave us willingly, she said. A mother knows, a wife knows. He loved you, Mom, Emma said, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. He never stopped loving you, Catherine nodded, tears gleaming in her eyes. Where is he now? Is he coming home? Emma and Daniel exchanged a pained look. They had agreed not to tell her about Thomas's terminal illness or his second family. He's been living under a different name in hiding, Daniel explained gently. He can't come back, it's complicated. Catherine seemed to accept this with the same quiet dignity with which she had faced everything in her life. At least now I know, she said. At least now I can stop wondering. 3 days later, Catherine Blackwood died peacefully in her sleep. The doctor said it was heart failure, not unexpected at her age and with her medical history. But Emma and Daniel wondered if perhaps, having finally received confirmation of what she had always believed, that Thomas had loved them, had not abandoned them willingly, Catherine had at last allowed herself to let go. They buried her beside the empty grave that had been placed for Thomas in the Pinewood Valley Cemetery 40 years earlier. The headstone had read, Thomas Blackwood, beloved husband and father, 1931-1976. Now, a matching stone was placed beside it. Catherine Blackwood, faithful to the end, 1937-2016. Emma sent a brief message to Thomas's Facebook account, informing him of Catherine's death. He responded with a single line, she was the best of us all. 6 months later, Emma received another Facebook message, this one from a young woman named Lucia Black, writing from Mexico. My father, Thomas Blackwood, Tom Black, died last night. Before he died, he told me to contact you. He said you are my sister. I have so many questions. And so the story continued, the children of Thomas Blackwood's 2 families connecting across borders, sharing truths and photographs, piecing together the complex legacy of a man who had lived 2 separate lives. There was anger, confusion, and grief on both sides. But there was also recognition of shared features, mannerisms, interests that transcended upbringing. Thomas's Mexican children were just as shocked by the revelations as Emma and Daniel had been, just as hurt by the decades of deception. In the end, it was Lucia who suggested they all meet, not to celebrate Thomas's memory, but to help each other process the complicated truth of who he had been. Emma and Daniel were hesitant at first. What could possibly come from such a meeting except more pain? But curiosity won out, the desire to see these half-siblings who had grown up with the father they had lost, to understand the other life Thomas Blackwood had created while they mourned him. They agreed to meet in San Diego, neutral ground between their worlds. The encounter was awkward, tense, filled with unspoken accusations and comparisons. Lucia, the youngest at 34, had her father's eyes. Marco, 37, had his build and the same way of tilting his head when listening, and Elena, the oldest at 39, had inherited his stubborn chin and methodical mind. They had grown up with a loving, present father, the same man who had left Emma and Daniel to grow up, wondering why they hadn't been enough to make him stay. "He was different with us," Eleanor admitted during their second day together, as they sat in a beachside cafe trying to bridge 40 years of separation. "After we found his letters, we talked to our mother. She said he would wake up shouting sometimes, especially in the early years. He never wanted his picture taken. He refused to travel to the States, even when Marco got a scholarship to UCLA. We never understood why, but now you know he was hiding," Daniel finished for her. Living in fear of being discovered, Marco, who had Thomas's direct manner, asked the question they had all been circling. Which version was real? The father who disappeared to protect his American family, or the father who stayed for his Mexican one? No one had an answer. Perhaps Thomas Blackwood himself couldn't have said which version was more authentic, the responsible family man of Pinewood Valley or the expatriate fishing charter captain of Puerto Vallarta. Perhaps they were both true, both incomplete. On their final evening together, Emma shared the contents of Bobby Winter's letters, and the Mexican siblings shared the confession Thomas had left for them. Together, these documents formed a more complete picture, a man haunted by his choices, who had convinced himself that each decision was necessary, who had built walls between his two lives until he himself could no longer see across them. "In his letter to me," Lucia said, "he wrote that he carried two hearts in his chest, that he loved two families completely but differently, that he was sorry for the lies but not for the love." Emma thought of Catherine, waiting by the window for decades, defending Thomas against every whispered accusation. "Our mother never stopped believing in him," she said, "even when everyone else thought he'd abandoned us." "Our mother didn't know who he really was until the end," Elena countered. "Her whole marriage was built on a lie." They were both right. Thomas Blackwood had been both devoted and deceptive, protective and selfish, present and absent. He had saved one family by sacrificing himself, then built another while keeping his past buried. He had protected and betrayed them all simultaneously. Before they parted ways, they exchanged contact information, uncertain whether they would maintain a relationship, but acknowledging the bond created by their shared blood and shared disillusionment. They arranged for Thomas's ashes to be divided, half buried in Catherine's grave in Pinewood Valley, fulfilling a reunion 40 years delayed, and half scattered in the ocean off Puerto Vallarta, where Thomas had built his second life. Standing at Catherine's grave a month later, watching the caretaker place a small urn in the earth, Emma felt a complex tangle of emotions: grief for the father she had lost twice, anger at his choices, empathy for his impossible situation, and finally, a measure of peace. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance of a truth too complicated for simple judgments. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mum was right all along," he said quietly. "He didn't leave us willingly." "But he stayed away by choice," Emma reminded him. "Yes," Daniel nodded. "Both things are true." As they turned to leave the cemetery, Emma noticed a small stone marker that had been added beneath Thomas's original headstone. It read simply, "The truth is rarely pure and never simple." It was a fitting epitaph for Thomas Blackwood, a man who had lived and died in the shadows between truth and lies, between presence and absence, between two families who would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile the father they remembered with the man he had really been. Life went on. Emma returned to her research, tracking birds that migrated between worlds, Daniel retired from military service and started mentoring at-risk youth, helping them find better paths than his father had taken. They maintained sporadic contact with their Mexican half-siblings, exchanging holiday greetings and occasional updates, bound by blood and shared history, but separated by the gulf Thomas had created. Sometimes Emma would think about the moment she had discovered her father's Facebook profile, that instant when 40 years of certainty had shattered. The grief and anger had faded somewhat, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of human frailty and the impossible choices people sometimes face. Thomas Blackwood had been neither hero nor villain, neither perfect father nor complete deserter. He had been simply complexly human, capable of great love and terrible mistakes, of sacrifice and selfishness in equal measure. In the end, the most valuable truth Emma had learned was not about her father at all, but about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of loss. For 40 years, the Blackwood family had lived with a false narrative, the tragic death of a devoted husband and father. It had been a comforting fiction, easier to accept than the messy reality. But truth, even painful truth, had brought its own kind of peace. Not the peace of a perfect resolution, but the peace that comes from finally setting down the weight of uncertainty, of questions unanswered and mysteries unsolved. On the anniversary of Catherine's death, Emma visited her grave, now marked by a double headstone with Thomas's name corrected to show his actual death date. She placed flowers between the stones, honoring both her mother's unwavering faith and her father's complicated legacy. As she stood there, she imagined them reunited somewhere beyond understanding. Catherine finally receiving the answers she had waited a lifetime to hear. Thomas finally facing the woman he had loved and left behind. "I hope you found peace," she whispered, unsure whether she was addressing her mother or her father or both. A sudden breeze stirred the cemetery trees, sending a shower of autumn leaves spiraling down around her. Emma watched them fall, these brief, bright things caught between earth and sky, between one home and another, like her father, like all of them, in their own ways. She turned to leave, sensing rather than seeing a figure watching from the edge of the woods, a memory perhaps, or just a trick of light and shadow. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it was Thomas, standing at the boundary between two worlds, unable to fully inhabit either one. Then she walked away, leaving the past buried where it belonged, carrying forward only the wisdom it had brought. That love and betrayal can spring from the same source, that protection and abandonment sometimes wear the same face, that the truth, once found, might not set you free, but it might finally let you rest. As she drove away from Pinewood Valley for what might be the last time, Emma thought about the thousands of families harboring similar secrets, the missing who might not be missing, the dead who might not be dead, the pasts rewritten and identities discarded. Every family has its myths, its unspoken truths, its mysteries preserved like insects in amber. The fortunate ones never discover the lies beneath their foundations. The rest, like the Blackwoods, are left to rebuild on shifting ground, to create new stories from the fragments of the old. Emma's phone chimed with a message as she reached the highway, a photo from Lucia in Mexico, showing her newborn daughter. "We've named her Catalina," the message read, "after your mother." It was an unexpected bridge across the divide Thomas had created, an acknowledgement that despite everything, they remained connected by blood and by the complicated man who had given them life. Emma smiled through sudden tears, struck by the resilience of family bonds even in the face of betrayal. Perhaps that was Thomas Blackwood's true legacy. Not the deception or the dual lives, but the stubborn connection that remained between all of his children, a connection that had survived even his best efforts to sever it. She typed a reply with trembling fingers. "She's beautiful. Catherine would be honored." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Family finds a way." And in that moment, on a highway leading away from the past toward an uncertain future, Emma understood that the story hadn't ended with Thomas's confession or his death. It continued through all of them, through the children who carried his blood, through the grandchildren who would never know him, through the stories they would tell and the truths they would choose to preserve or discard. Some would say Thomas Blackwood disappeared in the woods in 1976. Others would say he fled to Mexico and built a new life. Both were true, just as he had been both villain and victim, both deserter and protector. The complexity of his choices would echo through generations, a reminder that every life contains multitudes, Every story has its untold chapters, and every truth once uncovered reveals a dozen more mysteries beneath. In the glove compartment of Emma's car lay a small package she had nearly forgotten. Thomas's wedding ring returned to her by Elena after their meeting. Catherine had kept its match on her finger until her death. Emma had debated what to do with it. Bury it, throw it away, keep it as a reminder of promises both kept and broken. In the end, she had decided to take it to a jeweler and have it melted down, transformed into something new that acknowledged both its history and its future. 2 interlocking pendants, one for her, one for Daniel, each containing a portion of the gold that had once symbolized an unbreakable bond. A bond that had been broken and reforged, reshaped by truth into something different, but no less meaningful. Just as they had been reshaped by the discovery that sometimes those we lose aren't truly gone, they've simply become someone else, somewhere else, leaving us to make sense of the absence they carved into our lives. Emma would wear her pendant not as a celebration of Thomas's choices, but as an acceptance of the complicated truth that he had loved them, left them, protected them, betrayed them, that he had been both the father of her childhood memories and the stranger who had built a second family in Mexico, that his story, like all human stories, defied simple categorization. As Pinewood Valley receded in her rearview mirror, Emma felt the weight of the past lightening, not disappearing, never that, but settling into its proper place in the landscape of her life, a place where it could be acknowledged without overwhelming, remembered without consuming. Thomas Blackwood would always be the father who vanished in the woods and the man they found on Facebook 40 years later. He would always be the source of both their deepest wound and their most profound lesson. And perhaps that was enough. Not a happy ending, but a true one. Not closure, but understanding. Not forgiveness, but acceptance of a truth too human to be easily judged. Thomas Blackwood had disappeared into the woods on a winter day in 1976, leaving his jacket hanging on a branch like a final message. Part apology, part farewell, part lie. 40 years later, his children had found him hiding in plain sight, a digital ghost in the endless forest of the internet. The search was over, the questions answered, the mystery solved. But some forests are too deep to fully explore, some truths too tangled to completely unravel. In the end, all they could do was accept that the father they had lost and found had been neither the hero they'd mourned nor the villain they'd feared, but simply a man who had made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences as best he could. As Emma merged onto the interstate, leaving Pinewood Valley and its ghosts behind, she thought of Teresa, Thomas's second wife, now grieving the man she had known as Tom Black. She thought of Catherine, who had waited faithfully for a man who would never return. She thought of all the lives forever altered by the choices Thomas had made that snowy December day in 1976. "You can never truly disappear," Emma murmured to herself, a truth she had learned through decades of studying migratory patterns. Every departure leaves a trace. Every absence creates a presence of its own. And sometimes the missing are not lost, but transformed into memories, into mysteries, into cautionary tales or heroic myths, depending on who's telling the story and what truths they can bear to face. Thomas Blackwood had tried to vanish completely, to sever all connections with his past. But blood and memory are stronger than distance, stronger than deception, stronger even than death. The father who disappeared in the woods had never truly been gone. He had lived on in Emma's analytical mind, in Daniel's sense of responsibility, in Catherine's unwavering faith. And now he would live on in the stories they chose to tell, stories of protection and abandonment, of sacrifice and selfishness, of a man who had loved 2 families but could only be present for one. It was early evening when Emma finally arrived home, the weight of the past days settling into her bones like an old familiar ache. She unlocked her front door and stepped inside, breathing in the comforting scent of her own space, untouched by the ghosts of Pinewood Valley. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Rachel. "How are you holding up? Need company tonight?" Emma smiled, grateful for the concern. "I'm okay, just tired. Call you tomorrow with updates." She set her bag down and moved to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine before settling at her computer. A notification blinked on her screen, a friend request on Facebook from Elena Blackwood Black. Thomas's daughter from Mexico had taken the first step toward maintaining contact, toward acknowledging the fragile bond between them. Emma accepted it without hesitation. then found herself scrolling through Elena's profile, seeing glimpses of the life her father had built after leaving them. Birthdays, graduations, family gatherings, where Thomas stood proudly among his second family, his arm around Teresa, smiling into the camera without a trace of the shadow that must have lived within him. There were similarities between the families that struck Emma with unexpected force. The way Daniel and Marco both tilted their heads when concentrating, the same dimple that appeared in her own smile and Lucia's, the shape of the eyes they all shared with Thomas. Genetics reaching across the divide he had created, connecting them despite his best efforts to keep his world separate. Emma closed her laptop, suddenly exhausted by the weight of it all. The wine tasted bitter on her tongue as she considered the strange inheritance Thomas had left them. Not money or property, but questions and connections, wounds and revelations. What would they do with this knowledge? How would they incorporate it into their understanding of themselves and their history? Daniel had suggested they write it all down, not for publication, but for future generations of both families, so the truth wouldn't be lost again. A record of Thomas Blackwood's 2 lives, of the choices he had made and their consequences, of the way his disappearance had shaped all of them. Perhaps in documenting the story, they could make sense of it, could transform it from raw pain into something approaching wisdom. Emma found herself nodding at the thought. Yes, the story should be preserved, not as judgment on Thomas, but as testimony to the ripple effects of his choices, to the resilience of those he left behind, to the strange, unexpected ways the past returns to us when we least expect it. The father who had vanished in the woods had been found at last, not in the wilderness where they had searched for him, but in the digital forest of the modern world, hiding in plain sight among billions of profiles and personas. Era tarde de mai. It was too late. The phrase from Thomas's confession letter to his Mexican children echoed in Emma's mind. Too late for Thomas to undo his choices. Too late for Catherine to know the full truth. Too late for Emma and Daniel to reclaim the father they had lost. Too late for Teresa and her children to preserve the uncomplicated memory of the man they had known as Tom Black. But perhaps not too late for understanding, for connection, for some measure of peace amid the ruins of what might have been. Emma's gaze fell on the small potted plant by her window, a cutting from Catherine's garden that she had taken after the funeral. It had nearly died during the first month, withering and dropping leaves until Emma was certain it was beyond saving. But she had continued to water it, to turn it toward the sunlight, to speak to it in the same gentle tones Catherine had used with her plants. And slowly, impossibly, it had revived, putting out new growth, reaching toward the light with fresh green leaves that bore no trace of its earlier struggle. Life finds a way, Emma thought, touching one of the glossy leaves. Even after devastation, after betrayal, after loss so complete it seems nothing could ever grow again. Life persists, adapts, transforms, just as they had all done in the wake of Thomas's disappearance, just as they would continue to do now that the truth had been revealed. Outside her window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed Thomas's journey from one life to another, that had watched over all of them as they navigated the aftermath of his choices. Emma raised her glass in a silent toast to those distant points of light, to the universe that had finally brought them full circle, to the father who had disappeared in the woods and reappeared on a social media profile 40 years later. To the truth, she whispered, however complicated, however painful. And somewhere perhaps Thomas heard her. Era tarde de mai. It was too late, but it was also, finally, time. The next morning, Emma woke to find an email from Lucia containing scanned copies of the letters Thomas had written to his Mexican children before his death. She hesitated before opening them, uncertain whether she wanted to know what he had told them, what justifications or explanations he had offered. But curiosity won out, as it always did with Emma. The scientists need to know, to understand, to see the complete picture. The letters were surprisingly candid. Thomas had spared himself nothing in the telling, admitting to cowardice as well as courage, to selfishness as well as sacrifice. He had explained the initial threat that drove him to disappear, the mob connections, the fear for his family's safety, but had also acknowledged that his decision to remain hidden long after the danger had passed had been driven by more selfish motives. Fear of legal consequences, fear of Catherine's anger, fear of Emma's and Daniel's rejection, and finally, Fear of losing the new family he had built in Mexico, the new identity he had created for himself. "I told myself I was protecting everyone by staying away," he wrote to his Mexican children, "but the truth is more selfish. I was protecting myself from judgment, from consequences, from having to face the pain I had caused. It was easier to be Tom Black, with no past, no complications, than to be Thomas Blackwood with all his mistakes and responsibilities. I chose the easier path, and others paid the price for that choice." Emma found herself nodding as she read, a strange sense of validation washing over her. Her father had known what he was doing, had understood the pain he was causing, had made his choices with open eyes, if not a clear conscience. There was something almost comforting in that knowledge, not that he had intentionally hurt them, but that he had been aware of the consequences, had shouldered that knowledge, even as he built his new life in Mexico. In his letter to Lucia, his youngest, Thomas had written, "You once asked me why I never wanted to visit the United States, why I seemed to flinch whenever it was mentioned. Now you know. There was another family there, a wife who never stopped waiting for me, children who grew up with a ghost instead of a father. I couldn't face them, and I couldn't face myself when I thought of them. So I built walls between my two lives, convinced myself that what they didn't know couldn't hurt them. I was wrong. The truth always finds its way home eventually, just as you have found your way to your American siblings if you choose to reach out to them, just as they have found their way to the truth about me. The truth always finds its way home eventually." Emma read the line again, struck by its simple wisdom. For 40 years, the truth about Thomas Blackwood had been buried in the woods of Pinewood Valley, hanging like that abandoned jacket on a branch, a false clue in an elaborate deception. And now it had emerged, had made its way back to those who needed it most, had transformed their understanding of the past that had shaped them. Emma forwarded the scanned letters to Daniel with a brief message. He knew what he was doing, all of it. "Read these when you're ready." Then she turned to her work, to the migration patterns of birds that somehow always found their way back to their starting point, no matter how far they traveled. Nature's homing instinct, written into DNA, guiding creatures across vast distances toward the place they belonged. Thomas Blackwood had tried to override that instinct, had attempted to sever all connections with his past, but in the end, the truth had found its way home, had completed the circle his deception had begun. In the months that followed, Emma and Daniel maintained tentative contact with their Mexican half-siblings. There were video calls, exchanged photographs, hesitant attempts to bridge the gulf Thomas had created between his two families. They shared stories of the man they had known, the devoted but haunted father in Mexico, the loving presence-turned-absence in Pinewood Valley. Gradually, a more complete picture emerged of Thomas Blackwood, a man divided between two lives, two identities, two versions of himself. Teresa, Thomas's Mexican wife, initially refused all contact with Emma and Daniel, too devastated by the revelations about her husband's past to face the living embodiments of his deception. But as the first anniversary of his death approached, she sent a brief message through Lucia. "He loved you. He never stopped loving you. That much I know is true." It was both comfort and pain to hear those words, confirmation of what Emma had always wanted to believe, but also a reminder of how little that love had counted when measured against Thomas's fear and self-preservation. He had loved them, yes, but not enough to come back, not enough to tell them he was alive, not enough to be the father they needed instead of the ghost they mourned. Daniel struggled more with the revelations than Emma did. His military background had instilled in him a black-and-white view of duty and honor that made it difficult to reconcile with Thomas's choices. "I understand why he left," he told Emma during one of their frequent phone calls. "I even understand why he stayed away at first, but after the danger was gone, after we were adults, he could have contacted us, he could have explained. He chose not to. That's what I can't forgive." Emma understood her brother's anger. She shared it, to some degree. But she also saw the impossible situation Thomas had created for himself. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to return. The more his second family grew and took root, the more impossible it seemed to acknowledge his first one. The years had piled up like sedimentary layers, burying the truth deeper and deeper, until unearthing it would have meant destroying everything he had built in Mexico. He was a coward, Daniel insisted, taking the easy way out, until the very end. "Yes," Emma agreed, But he was also a man facing an impossible choice. Both things can be true. That became their refrain in the years that followed. Both things can be true. Thomas Blackwood had been both protector and deserter, both victim and perpetrator, both loving father and faithless husband. His story defied simple categorization, simple judgment. It required them to hold contradictory truths in balance, to acknowledge the complexity of human choices and their consequences. 5 years after discovering their father's Facebook profile, Emma and Daniel traveled to Puerto Vallarta at the invitation of their Mexican half-siblings. They stayed in the small house Thomas had built near the beach, slept in guest rooms decorated with photographs of his second life, sat at the dining table, where he had presided over family meals for decades. It was surreal and painful and strangely healing, this immersion in the world he had created after leaving them behind. Elena showed them the charter fishing business Thomas had built, now run by her husband and oldest son. Marco took them to the small restaurant where Thomas had first met Teresa, working as a waitress in 1979. Lucia, the family historian, shared albums of photographs documenting Thomas's life in Mexico, birthdays, anniversaries, fishing trips, graduations, a complete life filled with ordinary joys and sorrows, unfolding parallel to the emptiness he had left in Pinewood Valley. On their last evening in Puerto Vallarta, Teresa finally agreed to meet them. She was 70 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with grief and recent shock, but still beautiful in a dignified, reserved way. She sat across from Emma and Daniel at a beachside cafe, studying their faces with uncertain eyes. "You have his look," she said finally, her accent thick, but her English clear. "Especially you," she nodded to Daniel. "Same eyes, same way of sitting." They talked awkwardly at first, three strangers connected only by their love for a man who had deceived them all in different ways. But as the evening progressed and the initial tension eased, Teresa began to share stories of the Tom, she had known. "He had nightmares," she said, echoing what Elena had mentioned during their first meeting. "For many years, he would wake up shouting names. Your names, I understand now. And your mother's. Catherine." She pronounced it carefully, giving weight to each syllable. "Sometimes he would be so, what is the word? Melancholic, for days. Now I understand why." "Did you ever suspect," Emma asked gently, "that he was hiding something?" Teresa nodded slowly. "I knew there was something in his past, something painful, but I thought perhaps a divorce, a bad ending. Not this, not a whole other family believing he was dead." She looked down at her hands, twisting a gold wedding band. "He was a good husband to me, a good father to our children. This is true, but now I wonder if I ever really knew him at all." The same question that had haunted Emma and Daniel for years now haunted Teresa as well. Who was the real Thomas Blackwood? The man who had disappeared in the woods, or the man who had emerged in Mexico? The father who had left them, or the father who had stayed with his second family? Perhaps there was no single answer, no definitive version. Perhaps he had been all of these men at once, compartmentalized but complete. "He loved you," Daniel said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. "That much I'm sure of. Whatever else he did, whatever mistakes he made, the man I remember from childhood loved his family. Both his families, it seems." Teresa's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for saying this. It helps to hear it from you." They parted that evening with a fragile understanding. Three people bound together by their connection to a man who had lived a divided life, who had carried the weight of his deception for 40 years. Not friends exactly, but no longer strangers either. Fellow travelers on an unexpected journey through the ruins of what Thomas Blackwood had built and destroyed. On their flight back to the States, Emma stared out the window at the clouds below, thinking of her father crossing this same stretch of sky decades earlier, fleeing one life and heading toward another. Had he looked down and thought of what he was leaving behind? Had he felt the weight of his choice even then, or had the relief of escape overwhelmed everything else? "I think I understand him better now," Daniel said, breaking the contemplative silence between them. "Seeing where he lived, meeting Teresa and the others, I still can't forgive what he did, but I understand it better." Emma nodded, grateful for her brother's evolving perspective. "We'll never have all the answers," she said, "but maybe we have enough to make peace with it." "Peace," Daniel echoed, testing the word. "Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe never, but peace. Yes, I think that's possible. As the plane began its descent toward home, Emma thought about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. From the snowy woods of Pinewood Valley to a Facebook profile to a beachside house in Mexico. A journey that had begun with a disappearance and ended not with a true return, but with a kind of understanding that transcended physical presence. Thomas Blackwood had disappeared in the woods on a winter day in 1976, leaving his family to wonder why for 40 years. When they finally found him, the answer was both simpler and more complex than they could have imagined. He had left because he loved them and stayed away because he feared the truth. In the end, it wasn't the wilderness that had claimed him, but his own choices. Choices that had saved them and scarred them in equal measure. 10 years after discovering their father's Facebook profile, Emma received a message from Lucia, announcing the birth of her second child, a boy. "We've named him Thomas Daniel," she wrote, "to honor both sides of his heritage." The name struck Emma like a physical blow. Thomas, the father who had disappeared. Daniel, the brother who had helped her uncover the truth. A new generation carrying forward the complicated legacy of Thomas Blackwood, transformed now into something hopeful, something healing. She forwarded the message to Daniel, who responded with characteristic brevity. Life finds a way. And it did, Emma thought. Through all the deception and pain, through all the years of separation and silence, life had found a way forward. Not erasing the past, but building upon it, acknowledging its shadows while reaching toward the light. The mystery of Thomas Blackwood's disappearance had been solved. The father who vanished in the woods had been found. But the true discovery had been something neither Emma nor Daniel had expected when they first saw that Facebook profile. Not the simple truth of their father's survival, but the complex reality of human choice and consequence, of lives built on necessary lies and painful truths, of the ways the past reverberates through the present and into the future. In the end, Thomas Blackwood hadn't disappeared at all. He had simply become someone else, somewhere else, leaving behind a void that shaped everyone who loved him. And in finding him, his children had also found a more nuanced understanding of loss and love, of protection and abandonment, of the impossible choices people sometimes face and the far-reaching consequences of the paths they choose. The father who disappeared in the woods in 1976 had been found 40 years later on Facebook. But the search had never really been for Thomas Blackwood himself. It had been for the truth about who he was and why he had left. And that truth, once discovered, had revealed itself to be neither simple nor complete, but endlessly complex, endlessly human. Like the migratory birds Emma studied, Thomas Blackwood had followed an invisible path away from danger, toward what he perceived as safety. Unlike those birds, he had never returned to his starting point. But something of him had found its way back, through blood and memory, through digital connections and shared stories, through the resilient bonds of family that had somehow survived his desperate attempt to sever them. The search was over. The mystery solved. The father who had vanished in the woods had been found 40 years later, hiding in plain sight on the digital landscape of the modern world. And in finding him, his children had also found a more nuanced understanding of the past that had shaped them, a past built on necessary lies and painful truths, on protection and abandonment, on a father's impossible choice and its echo through the decades. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the story settling into its proper place in the landscape of her life. Not disappearing, never that, but transforming from raw pain into something approaching wisdom. The father who had disappeared in the woods had been found at last. The truth, with all its complexity and contradiction, had finally been revealed, and in that revelation, Emma had found not the closure she had expected, but something more valuable, the understanding that some questions have no simple answers, that some wounds heal imperfectly, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is accepting the truth, however painful it might be. As the plane touched down, bringing them home from the journey into their father's second life, Emma thought of Catherine, faithful to the end, defending Thomas against every rumor and accusation. She had been right about one thing. He hadn't left them willingly, at least not at first. He had left to protect them from a threat that might have destroyed them all. What Catherine could never have known, what Emma and Daniel now carried with them, was that the man she had loved and lost had built another life while she waited by the window, had created another family while they mourned him, had become someone else entirely, leaving behind only the shadow of Thomas Blackwood, a shadow that had shaped their lives in his absence as surely as his presence might have done. It was a complicated truth, too nuanced for simple judgment, too human for perfect resolution, but it was their truth now, to carry forward, to learn from, to share with future generations, so the story of Thomas Blackwood, the father who disappeared in the woods and was found on Facebook 40 years later, would not be lost again. As they collected their luggage and prepared to return to their separate lives, Daniel placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Do you think he found peace?" he asked quietly. "At the end? Knowing we knew the truth?" Emma considered the question, thinking of the letters Thomas had left for his Mexican children, of the confession he had finally made after decades of silence. "I think he found relief," she said. "Not peace exactly, but the relief of finally setting down the weight he'd been carrying all those years." Daniel nodded, understanding the distinction. "And what about us? What do we find in all this?" Emma smiled sadly, thinking of the long journey from that first shocking Facebook discovery to this moment of tentative acceptance. "Not closure," she said. "There's no such thing, I think, but understanding, and maybe eventually forgiveness. Not for his sake, but for ours." They parted with a hug, each carrying a piece of the truth they had uncovered, each processing it in their own way. Emma returned to her research, to the migratory patterns that had always fascinated her, the invisible paths birds follow across vast distances, always returning to where they began. Daniel went back to his work with at-risk youth, perhaps seeing in each troubled young face a reflection of the choice his father had faced, to stay or to flee, to confront or to escape. And somewhere, perhaps, Thomas Blackwood watched over them all, his first family and his second, now connected by blood and truth despite his best efforts to keep them separate. The man who had disappeared in the woods had been found at last, not in the wilderness where they had searched for him, but in the digital forest of the modern world, hiding in plain sight among billions of profiles and personas. The search was over, the mystery solved, the story complete, but never truly ended. Heritade demise. It was too late. The phrase from Thomas's confession letter echoed in Emma's mind as she drove home from the airport. Too late for Thomas to undo his choices. Too late for Catherine to know the full truth. Too late for Emma and Daniel to reclaim the father they had lost. Too late for Teresa and her children to preserve the uncomplicated memory of the man they had known as Tom Black. But perhaps not too late for understanding, for connection, for some measure of peace amid the ruins of what might have been. Emma touched the pendant at her throat, the transformed gold of Thomas's wedding ring, remade into something new that acknowledged both its history and its future. Not a burden, but a reminder. Not an anchor to the past, but a compass for the future. The father who disappeared in the woods in 1976 had been found 40 years later on Facebook. But the search had never really been for Thomas Blackwood himself. It had been for the truth about who he was and why he had left. And that truth, once discovered, had revealed itself to be neither simple nor complete, but endlessly complex, endlessly human. Like the migratory birds Emma studied, Thomas Blackwood had followed an invisible path away from danger toward what he perceived as safety. Unlike those birds, he had never returned to his starting point, but something of him had found its way back, through blood and memory, through digital connections and shared stories, through the resilient bonds of family that had somehow survived his desperate attempt to sever them. As Emma unlocked her front door and stepped inside, she felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle had finally closed. The mystery that had shaped her life had been solved, though not in any way she could have anticipated. Thomas Blackwood had not been killed by a bear or a mountain lion. He had not been murdered by mob enforcers. He had simply chosen to become someone else, to start over, to leave behind the danger and the responsibility and the person he had been. It was the most human of solutions to an impossible situation, not heroic, not villainous, just desperately, fallibly human. And in recognizing that humanity, Emma found she could finally let go of both the idealized father of her childhood and the abandoning monster of her adult fears. The truth lay somewhere in between. A man who had made choices both selfless and selfish, who had loved his family enough to leave them and not enough to come back. She moved to her desk and opened her computer, where a new email waited from Lucia. Attached was a photograph of the newborn Thomas Daniel, sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware of the complicated legacy whose name he now carried. Emma studied the tiny face, searching for traces of her father, of Daniel, of herself. The next generation, innocent of the past that had shaped them all, yet connected to it by invisible threads of blood and story. Emma saved the photo, then opened a new document. "The father who disappeared in the woods," she typed, then paused, considering. After a moment she continued, "This is the story of Thomas Blackwood, who vanished on a winter day in 1976, leaving behind a mystery that would take 40 years to solve. It is also the story of those he left behind and those he found, and the truth that connected them all in ways none could have imagined." She wrote long into the night, recording everything they had discovered. The grand jury testimony, the mob threats, the elaborate disappearance with Bobby Winters' help, the new identity in Mexico, the second family, the Facebook profile that had finally revealed the truth. She wrote of Catherine's unwavering faith and Teresa's shocked betrayal, of Emma's and Daniel's journey from abandonment to understanding, of the complex legacy Thomas had left behind. When she finished, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Emma saved the document and sent it to Daniel with a simple message: "For the future, so the truth won't be lost again.